Well, we have now entered the month of June in our new year, new you journey. So, of course, it seemed like the perfect time to start talking about the relationship I had with my dad. So, today, that is the story we will discuss. We will at least get into the beginnings of our relationship. Of course, there will be a lot more to share in the future. But for now, let's just get started about who he was and kind of how our relationship evolved over the years. So, welcome back to Soulful Wonderings. Hi, I'm Heather. I am your host of Soulful Wonderings, and as I am making this recording, we are actually into the month of June, just barely, just a few days, and Father's Day is actually right around the corner. And I suppose, like many of you, I actually don't have a dad to celebrate anymore. But, this is different than how I felt around mom and Mother's Day. Because, obviously, I'm not a dad, so I don't have that to reconcile. And for some reason, it feels weird to say this, but I don't miss my dad in the same way that I miss my mom. And don't get me wrong, I loved my dad very much, but I just didn't have the same relationship with him. And I suspect that's fairly normal, right? That's normal. I think most of us tend to sort of gravitate to each parent differently, right? But the reality is, I think in my childhood, I saw him as, well, really the cause of some of our issues. And okay, here's the truth. And I'm not trying to speak ill of anyone. Okay, please understand that. But he was mean at times. He just was. He was a very hard man. And specifically, sort of how he treated my mom. So I think the feeling of relationship and connection to him just wasn't there in the same way as it had been with my mother. Looking back, I guess similar to how I watched how my mom not only treated people, but how she allowed people to treat her, I was watching how he treated people, how he was different with us than he was with mom, how he struggled with affection. And maybe it's because we were girls. Again, hard to say, but he was a total ass to my brother. So I think I equated that to how to how he treated males and females. I saw that difference. He seemed to be harder on boys in general. He seemed to expect more. And I was a full-on functioning adult before I knew why. And of course, now that I'm in this journey, it's like so many other things, I see it so clearly. And I wish I would have known all of this then. But again, that's a different story, and I digress. And see, my dad he was actually brilliant, y'all. All my life, we owned our own businesses, and the type of business kind of changed from time to time. And what I mean by that is we owned several different types of businesses. The first one I can remember was we were selling travel trailers, campers that you pull behind. We had a farm at one point. I remember that in my very early years. The concussion I talked about in the episode with my mom, that was when we lived on the farm. Others included, there was a convenience store. We were partners in a gravel pit. I've talked about that a little bit as well. We had a seafood restaurant. That was the one I probably remember the most because that was in my teenage years. And that's where I actually worked and helped more. Dad even had a wholesale seafood route where he would go and pick up seafood down on the coast and actually supply it to other restaurants in the area. So like I said, we kind of did a lot of different things. But the thing I really remember about my dad so much was that he just got it. I don't remember ever being in a business that wasn't successful. And if you came to him, just as an outsider and said, Mr. Drew, how are you doing this? He would tell you. He would help you. I saw him go step by step and tell people what to do. He would even go and help them get started. I can remember weekends, we're all running the restaurant and he is with another family, basically helping them get their restaurant going and getting it started. He was really just that generous and that gracious, because I think in his heart that he really wanted to see people succeed, and he felt like he sort of had this formula for success, and so he was very willing to share it with other people. But y'all, this man was a jokester. Oh my gosh, Lord, he would tell stories. And when I was a kid, I hung on every word, every single word. I thought he was funny, and it was just interesting. It just, all the things he said, all I could think was, what a life that he has led. What a fun life to lead. And I guess if only he had really led it, right? Because, there are things to this day that I still don't know what was really true and what was him embellishing. Um, I think there were elements of truth to them. I think just perhaps he embellished them a little bit to, I don't know, make them a little more fun. And they were fun, whether they were, I guess, whether they were real or not. Maybe that's why I want to be a storyteller. Maybe that's one of the things I got from him. And let me give you a little example. One of the ones that I always found funny was he would tell me about the time that he got kicked out of one of his college classes where he was apparently in school because his intention was to become a lawyer. Which, God help us all if that man had been a lawyer. Oh my gosh. But anyway, but you know the drill. Often when you're in a new environment, and especially back in the day, your first day of class, you would go around the room and you would introduce yourself. And like I said, this was back in the day. So he was in a time when you would say your name and you would say the main industry of your town. Well, my dad was from a small town called Spring Hill, Louisiana. It's up in North Louisiana. And they were known, I guess they're still known, for having a very large paper mill. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around a paper mill, but they stink. And that's just being conservative about it. They stink. Oh my God, it smells so bad. Like when you go through the town and you drive through, you sort of hold your breath, or you're kind of breathing really shallow, because you just can't seem to keep that smell from coming through the vents of the car. Anyway, it was bad. So as he tells it, it gets to be his turn. So he says that he's Drew. He's from Spring Hill, population, 1,053. I don't know. I'm making that up because I can't remember. But he's, 1,053 and one cat. And then he sits down. So the professor says to him in this kind of nasally, hoity-toity voice, "Well, Mr. Pace, why was there only one cat?" So Dad tells him, "Well, because all the others scratched themselves to death trying to cover up that paper mill." And the teacher said, get out now." And he just, oh my God, he used to get tickled at himself telling that story. And to me, it was funny. But one of the reasons he told me that, I think, later, was because when I was headed to college, I was going to Northwestern State. And I actually did not know this at the time, but that's where my dad had gone to college. I don't know if he had ever told me where he went, or maybe I just forgot. But I don't think I really realized that that's where he went to school until I had been accepted. And of course, we were discussing it as that was possibly my next step. But it was one of the times where he looks at me and he says, "Look, you may not really want to mention my name too much." He's like, being related to me may not really help you. In fact, it may not be a good thing for them to know who you are. And that's one of the things that was kind of crazy in my life. I used to say that I could mention his name to someone and either be given the world because the person loved him, or I might be shot on sight. I really wasn't sure. So yeah, fun times. But hear me, he would have you just engrossed as he told these, sort of elaborate stories. You wanted to know how it would end. He would weave it around and pull you in, and that was just him. That was just how he was. And the reality was, he was really a smart ass and very funny and had a quick wit, and I think he knew with these stories that he could get a laugh, and he usually did, at least from the people that, I'm going to say, didn't know the darker side of him or didn't know the truth. And, the people that hadn't heard that story already 100 times. But most of the time, that's what he did. He told stories. He told them to us, he told them to customers, he told them to everybody. But real conversations seemed to be a bit rare. Maybe that's why we went to Mom more. She was just kind of easier. With her, we could really talk, really, really talk about real things. But with him, if it wasn't a story, it was often him, sharing knowledge about something that seemed to be usually about business. That kind of, you see, what you need to do is this. And sometimes you got tired of that, or you got tired of him and my sister used to get into it all the time. They had different opinions on various political things. So often that kind of things would happen. Or again, like he's telling us how he built these businesses and the things that he had done. But none of it felt real. Do you know what I mean? There weren't these sort of real emotional conversations, if that makes sense. I don't know how to say it. Maybe they were all either fluff or business. And I'm not sure that that's true, but that's just often how it felt. And I guess there was also the part of me that even as a kid was unsure of how many of those stories were really real. You heard them over and over. You heard some of the same stories over and over. And I wondered how much of those things were real and how much they had been embellished and why. Why had he embellished it? And again, later in my life, I figured out that there was some of that stuff that probably really didn't happen the way he said. And maybe he was trying to make himself feel better. He needed to look better to us. I'm not sure. But that kind of feeling kind of didn't help that overall, I'm going to say, disconnect with him. But how I told you that every business we had, as far as I can recall, was successful, and there was something about that. There was something in his tenacity that I think made that happen. And that was something that also was just kind of how he was. It was just part of who he was. I don't know if you remember this story. I think I told it before, of when we went bankrupt. I know I said we were successful, but hear me out. We had a business partner, and that was the story that they told me, that that they were running this gravel business with this business partner, and so say he took off with all the money, and we were left with essentially nothing. So they made the decision to start this new business. And so Dad left. We were in Arkansas, by the way, kind of central, I think, Arkansas. And he left with basically nothing in his pocket but some change. And he was headed to South Louisiana to get seafood and to start off our first wholesale seafood route. So Mom had packed him food, sandwiches and whatnot, so he wouldn't have to buy food or whatever. He had what he needed. And he had this little suitcase, y'all. I don't think I'll ever forget that suitcase. I think I still have it. It was this little suitcase, and it held basically a change of clothes and his little shaving kit, and that was really it. And off he went. And he had this plan, and he knew what he was going to do, or he had a thought of what he was going to do, and he just made it happen. He just went, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then he went off and did it. And now this part I always found interesting, and I think this one's probably true. And I don't know how this really came to be, but he could understand Cajun French. I can't remember the story. I think he spent time down there. Maybe that was around school as well. That's not where Northwestern is, but maybe he spent time around college. But anyway, he could understand Cajun French. He couldn't speak it, but he knew what people were saying when they would speak. And he had made some friends down in, the little bayou towns. So he would kind of go to these little stores or these places that, sold fresh seafood or whatever. And he would just sort of hang around because he was trying to find out basically when the boats were coming in and things like that. Because he was looking for the best prices he could get on the shrimp and things like that. And of course, he was basically an outsider, right? He was a northerner. So they didn't want to share their news around him. So when they would come in, they would speak Cajun French to each other. So what he would do is he would just sort of wait around, maybe have a cup of coffee or something, just mind his business. And he was just hanging out and he was listening. And of course, they didn't know that he could understand everything they were saying. And so once he got what he needed to know, he would sort of, wave to the owner, see you next time, and head out on his way. But at that point, then he knew where to go for the best prices and such. And I know there's times when some of the things I've said about him sound a bit negative, but he was actually a very personable man. He was very friendly. He was a nice man. And he was pretty savvy about what he was doing, but at the same time, he was fair. Okay. He might have been savvy, but he was not going to mistreat someone. So the truth is, he made friends pretty easily. And things like that idea of, you know what, let me go listen until I get what I needed. I think that's kind of how he was successful, and not being deceptive, not doing anything like that. He really wasn't doing anything wrong, right? But he needed a good price, and he wanted to make friends with these people. He wanted to be go into business with these people. You know what I mean? Do business with them, purchase their goods, and take them back to where we live, and offer up these great seafood dishes and all these things. So it was a good partnership, but he needed to kind of get in with the crowd and make those relationships. So he figured out how to do it, and the truth was he had a knack for doing things like that. He would go, I need this, conventional way isn't working. So how can I make this happen? How can I problem solve? But that's something about him that I think I just really admired so much. And when I look back at that and remember those things about him, it makes me think that I think that's something I may have gotten from him, because I find myself doing that as well. Not all the time, and especially for my job, though. And look, I'm not saying that when I hit the wall, I don't have a moment, but I also can say, okay, this isn't working. What's a different tack? What can I do? And again, I think that's because I watched him do that all my life. So I guess to me, that was just the normal thing to do. That's what you did. You found a solution. If it was something that you wanted that bad, you found a solution. And of course, if I were only that brave and resourceful in my own business, for some reason, I tend to hold myself back there. I could do it everywhere else, but I struggle with this. Maybe it's just too personal and it's something that I want too much. I'm working on it, though. Anyway, my point is that with my dad, he really had some really great qualities, but he also expected a lot. He expected good grades. He expected hard work. And I find myself doing that part too. If I'm working to make this happen and you're in it with me, then I guess I expect the same thing from you. I expect that same level of commitment, that same level of hard work. And again, I think that's because that's what I watched him do pretty much all my life. But he also expected success. He worked hard and he got what he wanted. He would work hard and he would make these businesses successful. And I think he expected the same things from us. He expected us to go to school, to be successful people. But I think he saw us going into some kind of business as well. To him, I don't think he looked at what made him happy. I think he sort of looked at, oh, there's a need that I can fill. Or, oh, if I do this and I do this, and it just started It started kind of looking easy to him. He figured it out very easily. So, okay, that was the path he was going to go down. And I know that works for some people. And I'm in awe of the people that it does work for. But I struggle with that. And I think others do too. I think if they aren't aligned, I know I feel that way. If I'm not aligned with it, then it just doesn't seem to work for me. I see a lot of people do the same thing. Again, I'm fascinated by people who can do that, who can just say, okay, there's this niche that needs to be filled, so I'm going to do that. That's not necessarily their dream, or their thing that they really, really feel aligned with, but they see the need, they feel it, and they move on. Maybe that's what they're fulfilling, though. Maybe the dream they're fulfilling is just that they're great at business, and it doesn't really matter what it is. I don't know, but I'm in awe of people that can do that. But I sometimes wonder, they're successful, but are they happy? I mean, I guess money doesn't really buy happiness. It can get you there, though. You can be happy when you don't have the concerns of money. But are they really happy? I feel like that's another conversation as well, and we will get into that some. But yeah, I've often wondered that. So anyway, back to Dad. One of the things I really remember is his dad. Y'all, they looked so much alike. They both had white hair, and they had these brilliant, brilliant blue eyes. And they would literally twinkle when they were excited. I know people say that, but I'm telling you, it would really happen. And Grandpa, he was the sweetest man. He loved us kids, and he just, he always wanted to do for us, and he wanted us to come and see him and all the things. And he was just a sweet little man. And I didn't find out until much later that evidently the sweet old man may not have been the whole story, because apparently he was quite a son of a bitch when it was pertaining to his boys, which being my dad and his brother, and that he raised them to be tough, basically. And back in that generation, in that time, raising a boy to be tough was often done with we would probably call it a tough love, but it was just that there was big expectations. And I think there are many today that might even, they probably describe what happened to some of those kids as abuse. But that's what they did. They were toughening them up. They were making it, they didn't want them soft going out into the world so that they could succeed. And I'm not going to lie, when I learned that and started to understand that, it kind of broke my heart, because it broke my image that I had of this sweet old man. But by the same token, so much made sense about my dad as to why he was the way he was. He had learned it from his dad. I can even remember when we visited our grandparents, I always preferred kind of my mom's side. Was really just her mom. Her father had passed before I was ever born. But her side was just so lovely. And they were, they were huggers and just sweet, soft, affectionate people. And his side just wasn't. It wasn't that they didn't love us. It's not that. It wasn't that they didn't show us any affection. It was just very different. It was almost like a soft side and a hard side. It was odd, but it was obvious to kids. And, that generational learning thing was just so apparent. And it was hard for me as a kid, especially because at that time anyway, I just didn't get it. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why they were that way. But, it's also then become very apparent to me just how much I'm like him. I always thought I was more like my mom, that more soft and emotional side, Pisces. And while that's true, the way they took care of people, though, that's from both of them. Because, as much as he could be a hard ass, he liked to help people. And I often wonder if some of that came from his upbringing, but I haven't pinpointed why. And y'all, so many of my family has passed away over the years. I don't have anyone to talk to about this, so I'm having to try to just piece it all together and figure it out. For example, he would always want to pay for things. We go out to eat, and he would hurry up and pay before anyone else could. And I'm talking about a wad of cash he'd pull out of his pocket. And he and his brother were just alike. Something came up one time, I remember, and they both reached in their pocket and started handing out cash to pay. And I'm like, okay, easy. I can pay for my own. But they would sort of fight over who would pay. You know what I mean? Not really fight, but it would be, hey, I got it. No, I got it. And of course, they're both laughing the whole time. But they both seem to be very adamant about wanting to take care of others. So it made me wonder, did they not have money growing up? And then now they did because they both had successful businesses? I'm not really sure. I think my grandparents owned a store as well. And they certainly weren't rich. And, based on the time frame, they probably went through the Depression and such. But I don't think they were necessarily poor. I think they did okay. So did the boys, my dad and his brother, throw the money around because they could? Because they had it and they wanted others to be taken care of? Was the quote-unquote fighting, was that like a brother thing? Because they both owned very similar businesses at one time, and they both did really well in them. So, of course, I'm sure my uncle was, the older brother, of course, was successful. Sure, I'm sure Dad, being the younger brother, had to show that, well, hey, I'm successful too. I could pay for this. Just because I'm the little brother doesn't mean I can't take care of this. So it's just something that I've kind of wondered why, if it was just because they wanted to take care of people, and did that come from a lack of care they got at home? Did it come from a lack of resources they had at home, and now that they had them, they wanted to help people? Or had they seen that growing up where their family had always helped people, so that's what they did? I feel like it might have been a little more of that. That they were the type to just help people. And hey, when you needed something, you need to pay for something. Okay, well, here's money. You got to pay for it. Because that's very much how my dad was. It's very much how I am too. That I will, if I see somebody struggling, I'm like, okay, what do you need? Let's work it out. Let's find what you need. I guess I got a lot more from him than I thought, huh? But my dad wanted us to be successful so much that one time he actually went so far as to offer to buy me a restaurant. I told y'all we had a seafood restaurant at one time. It was basically an all-you-can-eat. I don't know if I remember those. Those are back in the 80s. All-you-can-eat seafood for $7.95 or $6.95 or whatever it was. And I mean, when I tell you we would wrap people around the building all night long coming through to eat that food, that's how it was. It was incredible. And once he did the restaurant thing, he kind of stayed with that through the rest of his life, really. And there was this restaurant he had found, and he wanted to buy it and give it to me to run. And that is crazy generous, right? I mean, it was, and I was so very grateful. I mean, I kind of couldn't get past the fact, oh my God, he's going to buy me this restaurant and just hand it to me. And but it was also a bit unexpected because I had never shown interest in doing that kind of work. I had always been creative. Once I moved away to college, I think I came home after I graduated for a little bit, but then I hadn't really lived at home since I went to college. And I'd moved away right after that, and, was doing TV and different creative things. So this was not a path that I had ever shown an interest in. But to him, as much as he knew that, I guess he thought that it wouldn't stick, or he didn't think I could make a living in it, so I would come back, or I'm not really sure. But to him, this restaurant was the thing I should do because it had worked for him, and he could set me up for success, and I would have a great life. And so to him, it made perfect sense. And well, of course, I'm going to hand you the keys to this building. And when I told him no, y'all, the look on his face was one I had never seen before. He just couldn't understand how I could tell him no. So I started explaining to him how I had spent a lot of my life doing things that my parents never saw. They never saw me play basketball. I got ready for prom alone. There were a lot of these milestones that my parents missed because they were working. We were always working. That restaurant was always there. And I didn't want that kind of life for my son. I didn't care if I was walking away from $1,000,000. That's not the life I wanted for my son. One, I don't think he ever actually knew that, how I felt about it, that all that stuff had been missed. But even with all of that, I don't think he could understand how I would turn it down. Basically, I'm handing you the keys to success. How could you do this? But there was also another part of it. This place that he had found was also in this little baby town in North Louisiana. I mean, when I tell you a little podunk town, oh my goodness. And it was going to be tough to get business there. I think some of the all-you-can-eat stuff was starting to fall off a little bit, first of all. And second, it was really small. You weren't going to rely on the people that lived there. You were going to have people come in from out of town. And I didn't want to fight that battle. And I just didn't want to live somewhere like that. Besides the work. God, y'all, restaurants are so much work. It's a lifestyle. You don't do anything else. You just work. That's all you do. I grew up with that, so I knew what it was going to take. And like I said, I had done it all my life. So I didn't want that for my life. But even as we had that conversation, I don't think he ever understood it. Again, in his mind, he was handing me success. What did all that other stuff matter? It was going to be successful. So who cares? You're going to have money. Who cares? But he did accept my answer, though, because he was like, Dad, I can't do this. And he just kind of looked at me and went, okay. And looking back on it, maybe it was stupid. Maybe it would have given me success, but I doubt it. I think I would have been miserable, and I would have felt all this guilt and felt like I had to stay there because, he had given it to us. So I'm glad it's the decision I made, but to this day, I'm sort of fascinated by his reaction and the fact that even though I was explaining it to him and telling him why I didn't want it, but how grateful I was, I really was. And I did share that with him. He just didn't get it. He was like, how could you just walk away from this? I'm handing you the keys to this. So yeah, I've always been sort of fascinated by our different reactions to things, especially since we apparently are so similar. But after my mom died, he was different. And I mean, of course he was. They had been together for so many years. And he remarried, but it felt like he was doing it he was looking for somebody to take care of him. He wasn't good at doing it himself. But just a lot about him changed. And of course, Mom wasn't there, and the way Mom did things wasn't there anymore. And so he did like a boy does it, which I do things more like my mom. So it was just very different the way he sort of handled things in his life. And it was interesting to watch. But of course, I was an adult at that time, and as I was an adult, our relationship had changed. I had a child, so I didn't see him as much. I didn't talk to him as much. So there were times I just didn't know a whole lot about his life. He's not a lot of a talker, remember? So there was just a lot that I'm sure that happened that I just didn't know about. He got sick. Well, he had been sick for years. He'd had a heart attack when I was 12 years old. So he's had heart issues for years and had fought that for years. But I can remember one time in particular, he called me. They had been working in a campground, him and his wife, and he actually had a heart attack. And I found out later that it was much worse than he had let on. One of the people that worked there with him drove him to the hospital, and I found out later that he essentially died on the way to the hospital, and the man was able to revive him. So yeah, it was pretty serious. So when they got him there, I think it was in Mobile where they took him. So I met them over there because I needed to be there to help make medical decisions and whatnot. And so I remember we were there, and they had to do some repairs to his heart, and they had to take a vein out of his leg. And I remember it was after, and he was mad. Y'all, he was fighting mad. And he's yelling at me because they had taken the vein off the leg. He had had a leg amputated a few years before, or at least a couple years before. He was diabetic. And where they had taken the vein was where the prosthetic goes on. So it was going to make it basically impossible for him to wear his prosthetic until that part of the leg healed, which of course changed his mobility, changed everything. So he was pissed. And of course, it proceeded to be my fault, because why not? Because, he's yelling at me, why didn't you tell them? I told you specifically to make sure that they didn't do this. And I'm thinking, how in the hell am I supposed to control what a doctor does? So I'm trying to talk to him. I'm trying to reason with him. I'm trying to say, Dad, they did what they had to do. It's going to be fine. We're going to make this work. He's not listening, though. He's just mad. So nothing is working. So it wasn't long before he looks me in the eye, and let me tell you something. The old him came out, and he looked me dead in the face and said, I'll kick your ass. And it kind of took me aback a little bit, I won't lie, but I never, because I was that baby of the family, okay? So he had never been as tough on me as he had been kind of on everyone else, and he had certainly never gone that far with me. But the truth is, I never missed a beat. I just looked him in the eye and I said, oh yeah, old man, get up, let's go outside. And I think it took that moment of realization for him to kind of snap out of it and realize how ridiculous he was being. That this wasn't anybody's fault. It had happened. It was what it was. And if he really wanted to kick my ass, I wanted to watch him try to stand up and do it. So then he calmed down, and we were able to talk things out and work it out. But it was one of the first times I think I ever really stood up to him and kind of, I think it's what he needed. I kind of gave it back to him in a way that a lot of people never had. He and my sister would argue, and him and my mom would argue and stuff like that, but I don't know that anyone had ever just really called him on his shit in that way. And so it was what he needed in that moment, though. And I think after that, he sort of looked at me a little differently. I wasn't the baby anymore. I was an adult. And if he wanted my help, we were going to have to actually talk and make this happen like adults. So I think he, like I said, he looked at me a little differently that way after that day. And I think I had always had a little bit of fear of him because, like I said, there were times he was just mean. But after that, all of that went away. Suddenly, he was human. Now, the heart thing, like I said, had been around for many years. He was in congestive heart failure for years. And then later, he was also fighting cancer, which was missed in a diagnosis it shouldn't have been. The doctors messed up, but I don't have enough information to ever do anything about that. But that's what happened. They missed it, and by the time they found it, it was stage 4. I wasn't as involved as I had been with Mom. So I didn't even really realize some of this until later, until we were all finally in a doctor's office and they said the word stage 4 to us. And I thought, okay, here we are. But he was stubborn, and I would ask him, okay, have you done this? Have you called this doctor? He would tell me how I'm still having this problem. Well, have you done anything about it? And you said the answer was no. He was waiting on the VA, who we all knew that wasn't going to get him anywhere. He had the money to go to a private doctor, but he didn't. So there was always an excuse. And I mean, sometimes I feel like I should have done more. Maybe I should have pushed him. I felt a little bit responsible that it got that bad and I hadn't done more to help him. But there were other times that I knew that I couldn't change him. He was going to do what he wanted to do. And I had a child and a family, and I had responsibilities of my own. So he was going to have to handle his. But, I hated to see how he was when he was really sick. He just seemed so alone. He was married, but it was a very different relationship, like I said, than he had with Mom. And, as hard as he had worked all of his life, it's not like he had some fortune or something sitting in a bank somewhere. And I'm not going to say that he had nothing to show for it, because that's not true at all. He touched a lot of lives and he lived a good life and all of those things. But you can't help but look at it and go, but what did he leave? That was a lot of hard work. What did it gain him? And I think it gained him a lot of things. I really did. But at the end, when I was watching him, he just seemed so alone and so broken. And that broke my heart. But I was very grateful for our relationship growth. I was very happy that it did grow the way it did, that we had a better relationship as I became an adult. And I'll always remember the lessons that he taught me. I'm grateful for the things that he instilled in me, even though it includes all that generational bullshit that I have to undo now. But like all of us, he did the best he could. And even though I miss him differently, I do miss him, and I miss him all the time. I loved him very much, with all the faults, with all the issues. He was my dad, and for the most part, like I said, he was a good dad. He was doing the best he could, and I know that is one thing that you can never deny to me, is that I know how much he loved us. So that's the gist of the story with my dad, or at least the beginning of it. So I hope you'll tune in our next episode, and we are going to talk through some of the lessons that came along with this relationship, and a bit about paternal love. So we'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and that it has helped you move forward in your journey in some way. Make sure and like and rate and subscribe and, do all those things for our podcast, because it really helps us out. Links and other important things you need to know will be in the show notes. And if you have ideas of topics you'd like to hear about or questions you want us to answer, you can drop those on the Soulful Wonderings page on either Facebook or Instagram, or you can drop us an email. Again, check the show notes for all that. If you're interested in theta healing or reading or just more spiritual topics, head over to our website, soulfulwonderings.com. In the meantime, take care of yourself and each other. Until next time.